Okay, hello students, and welcome to another session of From Web 2 to Web 3, from Wikipedia to Wikidata. And today I'm especially happy to host in our class Andrew Lee from the US. Andrew, why don't you introduce yourself to the students?
Sure. Welcome, folks, and thanks, Shani, for having me with the class. I'm always really excited to talk about Wikipedia and Wikidata. And one of the things that I'm probably best known for is being the author of a book called The Wikipedia Revolution, How a Bunch of Nobodies Created the World's Greatest Encyclopedia. And that is a book that I started writing in 2006. And it's probably the most popular kind of narrative account of how Wikipedia came from nothing to being the dominant reference work in the world today. And I was a Wikipedia editor starting in 2003, which is quite early on. I do remember back then in 2003 that Wikipedia was not a household name. It wasn't even coming at the top of every Google search that you pretty much expect it to now. And it was a revolution to me when I first saw it. And I said, something big is going to happen from this project, even back in 2003. And by the time it started to become very popular in 2005, I was one of the first academics to write academic papers about it as an example of participatory journalism or online communities creating content. Now, back in 2003, that was not the most easiest thing to convince folks of. And I do remember academics specifically rejecting papers that I had written saying, why are you studying an encyclopedia online? It doesn't make any sense. Why should I trust this thing? And I guess I can be quite satisfied that many years later, I've been vindicated in that not only has it gotten to the point that I predicted, it's actually exceeded that with new projects like Wikidata and Wikimedia Commons, and the role it has today in what we would call the fake news or the the crisis that we're kind of having now in terms of fact checking and finding out truth from fiction. So that is kind of where I've come from in my journey on how I discovered Wikipedia to being one of the most published folks around it. These days, what I'm doing is I'm working with the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Smithsonian on being their GLAM strategist, especially at the Met in New York. And that may seem like an odd thing as a journalism professor writing about Wikipedia, and now I am hitting this kind of vertical area of working with an art museum and their Wikimedia content. But I see it as a very logical extension in that what I'm doing, probably what you're doing with Wikidata, is kind of this ultimate accomplishment of Wikipedia, not as the English language article and the Hebrew article or the German article. And in fact, Wikidata is this idea that maybe we try to minimize the language differences, and can we centralize and put into one place the knowable facts, the kind of language independent representation of human knowledge in a way that brings everything together. And I think there's no better place to start than with the cultural and heritage institutions. And oftentimes the Metropolitan Museum of Art or other museums like it, like the British Museum, are what we call encyclopedic museums. Like they try to, very flawed way right now, but they aspire to be the breadth of all human art, right? Whether it is Asian or Western or South American. And we try to look at the breadth of art in the human condition and try to express that in a way that's universally accessible, right? So that is one of the goals of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I'm sure you've heard of it before, even if you've never been there. It is pretty darn good at doing that. So I think it's a really great place to start of saying, can we represent in a very accessible and semantic way the breadth of human art across 5,000 plus years just from the Met in Wikidata, in Wikimedia Commons, in a way that is comprehensive and useful. And that's kind of nice to hone in on. I say just 600,000 objects at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but it's a great starting point. I'd rather start small and get bigger than to try to embrace all of human existence in one shot. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now with the Met. And I can talk a little bit more about what those experiences have been like in terms of our challenges in modeling things and uploading that content to Wikidata and Commons.
Yes, we definitely want to hear more about the Met and the Smithsonian and even the Cleveland Museum. But before that, maybe we can give the students just a bit more background of the type of Wikimedia activities that you've been involved in. So you've been one of those people who do a lot of outreach. First of all, you're in DC, which
Right.
is let's say it's a glam heaven, right? You have so many big institutions in one place. And as you told the students, you've also done a lot of outreach in academia and educational institutions. So you've been doing it for a long time. So
Right.
maybe say something to the students about why it is that as a Wikipedian, instead of writing articles, you found yourself gravitating towards doing this type of outreach work and started to work with institutions, which is, by the way, one of my favorite things to do as well as a Wikimedian.
Right.
So I'm really curious to hear your experience.
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the reasons why, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area in the United States. I was actually born here. I haven't lived back here in a while. I grew up in this area. I went away for college and work, and I've just recently come back. And I've worked now in D.C. a lot with the National Archives, the Library of Congress on projects related to Wikidata. And now I'm working a lot more with the Smithsonian, which I've always been working with in some way, but the Smithsonian now has an open access policy they just announced, about a month or so ago, right before everything shut down because of COVID-19. They announced that the default policy of the Smithsonian was going to be releasing their metadata and their images in a public domain, what they call CC0 type of dedication. And that's huge, right? We're seeing that more and more museums are doing this. The Met led the way in many ways about 3 years ago to do this. The Cleveland Museum of Art that Shani mentioned was also an example of a year later. They also adopted a CC0, or releasing all their content by default, unless it is encumbered by, life of the author plus 70 years or whatever the copyright terms might be, whether it's a European, American artist. But the default should be whatever we have that shouldn't be copyrighted, we're going to release without copyright or with CC0, which is great because we saw that the default for most of these organizations, even if it's an ancient artifact or it's a painting that is very old, all these images that they put up on their website of these old artifacts, they put a standard copyright on the website. And it's like, oh, really? It's like old artifact. It's an old thing. Shouldn't you be releasing that for the public to use in some way? And it took a while, since 2010, when we first started working directly with GLAM organizations, right? Galleries, libraries, archives, museums, to convince them that, you know what, Wikipedia uses a free license. The world is going towards free licenses. Could you, as cultural and heritage institutions, start adopting free licenses more? And it took a while because, these organizations were very afraid of change. They move very slowly. These are organizations that typically take 7 years to plan an exhibit, if you can believe that. As a journalism professor, it drove me mad because I'm used to like 7 weeks or 7 days to do something, and we're talking about 7 years. But we were at it, lobbying them and working with them and getting individual museums and libraries to do this. And we found that, at the lower levels, most of the curators and the librarians were very much happy to release this stuff, but it's kind of your higher up folks, whether it's the legal people or the merchandising and the folks looking after finances. And they were the ones saying, oh, well, we make lots of money from selling postcards and umbrellas and things like that with these prints on it. So are we going to lose that revenue stream? So that whole issue is a whole nother talk. But I think we were very successful in getting these organizations to embrace CC0 or public domain, knowing that the net benefit to them was huge. And there are several papers that have been written saying the net benefit for giving it away is actually greater than trying to lock up all this content. So that's why we're very successful in working with these museums in recent years to say, hey, you know what? If you're trying to convince your board or your higher up management in your museum about your impact, about the spread of your artworks, there's no better way than to get that metadata and image information onto Wikipedia, and suddenly your traffic goes from tiny or medium to super big and super gigantic. And suddenly, measure your impact not in dollars brought in by the gift shop, but measure your impact in how much you have your digital assets out there for universities and schools to use, and how much people appreciate that that content getting out there. And the Met, Smithsonian, all these folks have gotten onto that trend, which is great to hear.
So before we actually see some examples of what it looks like, you mentioned the Smithsonian, and a month ago going out with a big statement of releasing 2.8 million items. It was a huge moment, I think, for the open knowledge movement in general, not only for us in Wikipedia, but just a big statement. Can you say something about why it was so important to people who are just starting to understand this world of GLAM and Wikipedia, etc., and open knowledge? Why was it so important?
Yeah, it was. I think it was important because, I think the default of all these museums and cultural institutions, most of their missions is a public interest mission, right? And then especially Smithsonian, which is funded by federal dollars, like taxpayer dollars in the United States. And if you go to any of these museums, they're free. I don't know how many people listening to this have ever been to Washington, D.C., but it is one of the most impressive things about the U.S., even though there's a lot not to like about the U.S. today, especially our leadership. But when you still go to D.C. and you stand in the middle of what we call the mall, it's a green big mall, and you're staring at this Capitol building, you have 8, 9, 10 so museums surrounding you, and they're all free, no admission. Whether it's Air and Space Museum, American Art Museum, modern art, African American history and culture, natural history, technology. It's amazing, and it is actually one of the most amazing things that we do as the United States is that the national museums are all free. Doesn't matter what nationality you are. You come to DC, all of them you can get into for free. And it's kind of ironic that the online content that the Smithsonian puts out there is not free. It's like, you can look at it on the screen, but if you want to try to use it in any way, even though the digital assets, it's pretty clear, should be free, the websites for the Smithsonian have what we call a blanket terms of use. And if you've ever used an Apple product or any other thing, and you notice there's like a 31-page document saying this is the terms of use, you may not do this, you may not do that. And the Smithsonian was a good example of, they just had a kind of a standard thing saying, oh, you may not use any image without our permission. And that's like, whoa, wait a minute. These images of like 5,000-year-old artifacts or 500-year-old paintings, they should be free by default under the letter of the copyright law. But by putting it on the Smithsonian website, they were encumbered by this. They were locked up by the terms of use. So it was existing under that weird state of affairs for a number of years. And even when we pointed out to the Smithsonian, and they were like, "Oh yeah, that's not good, is it?" I said, "No, that's not good." And they knew it was a problem. They wanted to release the content, but it took a while for their legal folks and everyone to figure out, is it okay? We do have some content that is, sometimes free, but not always free. So as I mentioned before, it took some time to get it out there. And I think we finally come to the point where we might have turned the corner so that museums that are not releasing their content under a CC0 or free license are the exception rather than the rule. To have the Met Museum, Smithsonian, Cleveland Museum of Art, and the most prominent museums in the U.S. start to say, this is our default policy. And this space of cultural heritage is very much a monkey see, monkey do, as we say. People want to keep up with the folks who are leaders, and hopefully they'll be following the leads of these top class museums.
Certainly. And I do want you to show the students some examples of how that looks like and what kind of stuff we can do when museums and cultural heritage institutions in general release images or release content. But before that, I'm kind of curious because you've been a professor at university teaching journalism, and you've been experimenting with Wikipedia and I think even Wikidata in your classes before you went on to be the strategist for the Met and the Smithsonian.
Right.
So wondering if you can say something about education and, well, in general, educational institutions and why it's even important that we keep experimenting in education with with these free knowledge platforms.
Right. I think, Shani, you and I are in a university environment. I'm sure we are always pushing up against the mythology that professors hate Wikipedia and ban it in the classroom. That's one of my most frustrating things I've ever heard in my life, because I was one of the first people to teach with Wikipedia in the classroom back in 2003, believe it or not. CNN even did a news story about my class saying, "Oh my gosh, look at these students! They're writing an encyclopedia online using this weird site called Wikipedia," and no one had heard of it back then in 2003. So CNN doing a story about weird students writing an encyclopedia was kind of funny, right? So that was
it was a milestone, right? It was definitely a milestone, and many more educators and institutions came following. But do tell, please.
Yeah. And then I remember when I posted that. So I mean, the community of editors of Wikipedia back then were small, so you could actually have conversations on our mailing list in a way that you don't see today, right? There's like tens and tens of thousands of editors of Wikipedia, so it's actually quite hard to have conversations in our community these days, because it probably doesn't surprise folks out there, but all you need is one or two people who are not very friendly to just ruin it for everyone, right? So all you need is a few people who are not cooperative in a conversation to just no one wants to talk anymore, right? But back then it was much smaller. So I remember sending out an email to the mailing list when the CNN crew was there, and I said, "Hey, CNN's doing a story about our class," because seeing Wikipedia on TV was like something no one had ever seen before. It was 2003. I mean, it wasn't even being written about by the technology press back then in 2003. So for the mainstream media to do a story about Wikipedia was amazing. And I remember Jimmy Wales, the Jimmy Wales who founded Wikipedia, sent back to the mailing list and said, "Wow, I think this is the first TV story ever about Wikipedia." He wrote this in 2003 about the class I was teaching. So yeah, I was using it back in 2003, taught a class of 80 students, believe it or not. So I put a class of 80 students on Wikipedia, and I basically randomly shuffled them up. And I said, for clusters of maybe six students or so, and I said, "Here's 12 articles I'm going to randomly assign to you folks. I don't want you to meet in person. I want you to collaborate on editing this article only online. And no chat, whatever. Use the talk page and try to do this." And, you put 80 new editors on Wikipedia in 2003. That's a big blip in the radar there. So you saw people going, "What's going on? All these articles about Hong Kong," which is where I was teaching at the time, are being updated really quickly. Like, who are these people? Because no one had seen like 80 students plop onto Wikipedia overnight before. So that was actually the start of, because of my class, they started a whole new page in Wikipedia called, university and college projects, just to track whether students were hopping onto Wikipedia. So at least they could coordinate among the Wikipedia editors, saying, "Oh, if you see a lot of activity for this one article, it may be these students of this professor's class." These days, before COVID-19 hit, you probably have dozens of classes per semester every year using Wikipedia as a playground or as a testing ground. So that was quite interesting back then to see that. But one of the things that frustrates me all the time is, university professors are not hating Wikipedia because of this. Before Wikipedia started, I was never allowed to use any general encyclopedia as a reference. Right, Shani? You could probably concur with this. You can't use Britannica as your reference. You can't use World Book. And back then we had Encarta. You can't use Encarta. So I love this quote from a librarian who defended Wikipedia. And she said, don't use Wikipedia as a reference for your papers. Not because it's Wikipedia, but because it's a general encyclopedia. Right? And that's the best encapsulation. It's not because Wikipedia is flawed, because it's terrible. It's because you shouldn't be using any general encyclopedia for your academic papers as a reference, right? And I don't want to say never, but there are certain very narrow provisions where you should maybe cite a general encyclopedia. But in general, you should be going to your original primary sources, the original paper, the original Lancet paper, the original electrical engineering journal paper, right? And that's kind of my big beef, is that, people saying, "Oh, Wikipedia is terrible because university professors are banning it." No, I tell my students to use it all the time. I say, I wish Wikipedia was around when I was a student, because I think it's the best way to get up to speed on a topic very quickly, and look at the bottom for the references to find out where the primary references are. And you can launch from there much faster into a topic when you have the Wikipedia article as your starting point.
Yeah, and actually today we have research showing that many academics and the students themselves actually use Wikipedia all the time. And we also have research in education showing that using Wikipedia as a platform for learning actually helps the students to develop various skills, various capacities, literacies that are needed in our digital age. So all in all, it's kind of a win-win. It's not easy to do, but it's a win-win when it's happening well. Okay, and so I want to show the students, just to wrap up this part. I didn't mention at the beginning, but Andrew is basically joining us for kind of 3 or 4 parts, different parts. I've asked him to talk about a variety of different topics. And in the first one, I just wanted you to get to know him a bit and know about the cool stuff that he's doing.